September 30th of 2015 at 6:42 in the evening.
911, what is your emergency?
A dispatcher for the Alt Police Department in Colorado gets a call from a very distressed woman.
My daughter, she texted me at about midnight last night and said she had a really bad feeling that something bad was going to happen, to stay close to my phone. And I was, of course, asleep, but I didn't see the text till today. And I've been trying to get a hold of her all day and never could get her.
Her mother's instinct tells her that something awful has happened.
Okay, so what do you think's going on right now?
I think she might not be alive, to be honest with you.
Mothers have instincts about these things, and if the mother says that, I would be concerned as well.
I just have this really bad feeling inside that I think something really bad happened.
And your official title at the time of this?
In 2015, I was the lead detective on this case for the Weld County Sheriff's Office in Colorado. This case first got started with a woman getting in touch with the Alt Police Department and wanting to report her daughter as missing.
I think something really bad happened.
The woman's name is Vonda Holt. Her daughter's name is Tara Lewandowski. Vonda thinks her daughter may be dead.
You're allowing us to search your premises.
Officers do a welfare check at the residence where Tara lived.
They went out to the house to see if she was there and talked to the folks that were on scene there.
They've encountered two roommates who also say they have no idea where she is.
I haven't seen her since we dropped her off at Virgin Trail.
The roommates report that this girl, Tara, believes she was developing pneumonia. She had a terrible cough.
So they took her into Greeley and dropped her off at an urgent care.
The roommates say that she never returned. DJ Meyer is the homeowner, and he has a girlfriend, Crystal, who lives with him. He invites the officers in, and they look around in the place.
So what's in here?
They look around. They find nothing of real interest. They see nothing out of place, no evidence of a struggle or a fight. And they find no Tara. She is now a missing person.
And that starts the process going towards looking for what happened to Tara.
Detective Anderson and Detective Boyle need to find this girl.
We dove in and we did an interview with Vonda.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your daughter, ma'am?
I really felt like she'd been murdered. I was really afraid they were going to think I was nuts.
I wanted to learn more about Tara and her history.
Tara was a really happy child. She was extremely smart.
She had a lot of love and a lot of compassion to give. She always wanted to be a vet. And that was before her dreams got crashed by a car accident.
She had multiple surgeries out of that one accident.
It changed the whole trajectory of her life. She got hooked on pain pills. She was always in pain. She was at a rehab. One of the ladies in there was Crystal. They were friends.
Crystal offers Tara a place to stay. Crystal Griffin is the girlfriend of DJ Meyer, the homeowner. So DJ Meyer is in fact Daniel Meyer, a respected member of the community and a respected member of the city council.
She was on disability, and they were going to rent her the room for $100 a month. She thought it was a great opportunity.
Tara moved into this house with DJ Meyer and Crystal Griffin.
When's the last time you actually spoke to Tara?
And then one night, Tara texts Vonda saying, "Stay by your phone, something might happen." And Vonda gets the text the next morning at around 5 in the morning when she's getting ready for work.
When I woke up, I tried to reach her and I couldn't get a hold of her. Tara had a pain specialist appointment that day. And so I called and I said, Vonda, she didn't show up.
Vonda said she got this weird feeling come over her and she thought something bad happened and she called 911.
The mother explains that Tara has a dog that never leaves her side, a black Chihuahua whose name is Diablo.
According to Vonda, she was very, very attached to her dog, Diablo.
Tara never went anywhere without her dog. It didn't matter if she went to the doctor, it didn't matter if she went to the store. That was her sidekick, period.
The dog is also missing. It's a total mystery. However, they are fortunate that someone was about to make a discovery.
There was a rancher that called in to law enforcement and said, hey, I found this dog a few days ago.
A farmer sees a small black Chihuahua wandering around on the side of the road near the Pawnee grasslands, and he thinks he's going to rescue this creature. At the same time, Vonda posted a photograph of her daughter and the dog on Facebook. The farmer sees the posting and decides he's got that dog. So he calls the Weld County Sheriff's Department to report this.
I went out to that rancher's house and took a couple photos of the dog. And then I sent those back to Vonda, and she confirmed that that was Tara's dog, Diablo.
This is a very promising event. We've solved one part of this mystery. Now we need to solve the other part. Where is Tara? They search far and wide around the Pawnee grasslands where the dog was discovered.
We even had State Patrol fly over looking for mounds or fresh dirt, like a grave.
Those first few days, it was pretty extensive, but we just weren't finding anything. We were needing an additional lead to follow up on.
So they bring in Tara Lewandowski's roommate, DJ Meyer, as to knowledge of her disappearance.
Well, what I want to talk to you about is Tara.
Okay.
Yeah.
I dropped her off at urgent care. You know, and we dropped her off, and she stood out.
Who's we?
Me and Crystal.
Crystal?
My girlfriend. Her last name was Griffin.
DJ Meyer is cooperative and helpful. He says since she didn't drive, she asked him for a ride to an emergent care in Greeley, Colorado, a short distance away. He then says they tell her when they drop her off, we're going to go get lunch with my grandmother, and we'll be back in about an hour and pick you up.
Well, when we went back to urgent care, she never checked in.
I said, I don't know where she's at. I took her to the doctor and I haven't seen her since.
They asked him, so what do you think happened to her?
DJ said she's probably downtown looking for her drug dealer.
I think a guy by the name of Cheech. I don't know his last name. I don't know what he does. I know he hangs out at Lincoln Park.
He believes that instead of going into the emergent care, she went and found Cheech and fell off the wagon. Anderson and Boyle have been looking for another place to go besides DJ, and he's just provided it. Who is Cheech, and where is he right now? Detectives Anderson and Boyle have received a tip from Tara Lewandowski's roommate, DJ Meyer. He says she may have made contact with a drug dealer he knows as Cheech.
When he provided that information, we tried to track down that drug dealer, Cheech.
It's a street name. Every agency has these lists of names, monikers, gang members, sex offenders. You name it, we've got a list.
I had recently been undercover for the drug task force, so I called them, and nobody had ever heard of Cheech.
So they decide that this is nonsense. They're going to rule it out. But the problem they have at the moment is they don't have a body. They don't have a crime scene. They know that Tara texted her mother and said something bad might happen tonight in DJ's house. That's all they have. So you have to keep at it.
She didn't have a phone at that time. She had a tablet that she was using, so she mainly texted.
There was no tracking her cell phone because she didn't have one.
So that's another strike against them. But then, 2 weeks in, their detectives' luck changes. A man walks into Weld County Sheriff's Department. He says his name is Richard, and he has a sister whose name is Crystal Griffin, DJ's girlfriend and former roommate of our missing person. Richard says, "My sister knows something about this."
He said that at some point in the couple weeks following the homicide, she had disclosed to him that she had been in the house when Tara had been murdered.
This is the type of tip that convinces you that there is a God. We have a focus now. If you're going to tell anybody about a bad thing, you're going to tell blood before you tell a stranger. They bring in Crystal Griffin and take her back to an interrogation room.
She started telling us the story. It was really hard to believe her because it was really so far-fetched.
So, tell us a little about DJ.
DJ is kind of living a double life.
Crystal begins her statement by saying that my boyfriend DJ, you don't really know who he is. He's a member of the city council, yeah, he is. But he's also the enforcer of a motorcycle gang called the 21 Biker Club. Anderson and Boyle have never heard of that. What is that? Well, it's this group of people. They're all friends, and they all belong to this gang. Where do they ride? Well, they don't have motorcycles. What? It's a biker gang, but they don't have motorcycles.
She explained to us that this group was trying to be some sort of gang.
She said they were infatuated with knives and weapons, stabbing pillows and trees.
There we go.
She kind of laid out the hierarchy a little bit of the group. Tom Vassell was Mike Vassell's father, and he was supposedly the president of this group. Mike Vassell would have been the second in charge. DJ Meyer was supposedly the enforcer of the group. Chad Eiler was a friend of the group. Carly Hanchett was Mike's girlfriend. And then Carly's brother, Scott Hanchett.
Except for Tom. DJ was the oldest one at that time, and I think he was over 30, and all the way down to Carly, who was 17.
She also said Tom Vassell had been part of some sort of biker gang when he was back in New York.
Supposedly, he was a former Hells Angel.
I think he maybe worked on bikes for them, but not a full patch member or anything. And I think that history probably intrigued his son Mike and the rest.
There's some seriously scary stuff.
Crystal disclosed that there had been some sort of an issue in the house and that everybody else had decided to kill Tara upstairs in Tara's bedroom. She said that during that time frame, she had gone into a downstairs bedroom and never went upstairs to see what was going on. And then she said that afterwards, she had been with them when they loaded Tara's body up and took it to dump it. She was not able to give us a specific location on where they had dumped the body.
Both detectives understand this story is bizarre, But they also know there is a house where Crystal says this crime occurred. Based on her information, they obtain a search warrant for the house, which is owned by DJ.
There was a lot of cleaning products out in the kitchen. If I remember right, there was a bottle just labeled bleach. Seemed a little odd.
They're looking for evidence of death in this house, primarily blood evidence in a place that is thought to be a violent crime scene. They use a technique called luminol. Luminol is a chemical that will cause human blood to fluoresce in darkness. They go into the room where Tara lived, and they luminol the walls, the ceiling. There is no blood in this room where Crystal says she was killed. They check the other rooms, and they find nothing. There is no evidence of blood in this house. Did they clean up? Or Crystal's story isn't true?
Hey, folks.
Henderson goes outside, and he sees two people next door. He goes over and introduces himself, shows them a bed, and says, "Anything unusual here in the last few days?" "Oh, yeah." "Oh, what was that?" "Well, DJ, the guy that lives there, we saw him digging a hole in the backyard, and he had something wrapped up in a blanket." They say, "We thought he was digging a grave." "Really?" They go check the backyard. They do find what appears to be a grave and freshly turned earth.
They ended up excavating what appeared to be a fresh grave site.
And then it happened.
There's something here.
I can't remember who dug it up, but they said there's bones.
They begin looking at this grave site. They find bones. But there's a problem. They're not human. They're a dog, a buried dog. They know this is not Tara's dog because they have Tara's dog. It's with the mom. So where are they now? No body, no crime scene. Crystal's story doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Then she has a relationship with DJ. What if she's just mad at him and wants to give him up for a disappearance and a homicide? It's time to talk to her again. Crystal said in her initial statement, she was forced to accompany this group as they disposed of the remains. "Okay, Crystal, take us to the body." They put her in a car and they drive north toward Wyoming.
We spent a lot of hours in the car trying to get her to remember things that she had seen when Tara's body was dumped.
She said it was dark, it was late at night. I'm not sure, but there was water running nearby.
She took us right over the Wyoming border. She would show us different things that she thought looked familiar, but it was never the right place.
So now Crystal has another problem with her story. The body isn't in the area where she says it was. So has Crystal just invented this whole thing? What's going on?
In the car, we ended up trying to gather as much information from her verbally to at least paint a picture of what had happened with Tara. Crystal's story was that Tara had had some sort of a disagreement or an argument with Carly the night before. And it was all over a stereo that was too loud. Tara had said something that made the group think that she had disrespected Carly.
What does she think she is anyway? This is so messed up.
Being that Carly was dating Mike, who was the second in charge of this gang, they had to do something about it.
She has been disrespected, and it's a meaningful thing in the biker world. and it's a death penalty offense. Even though these people have no idea what the biker world is all about, only what they've heard or seen in the movies. According to Crystal, because of the rules of the gang, the enforcer is called upon to carry it out, and that is DJ, the owner of the house.
We were wondering if she was even being truthful about a lot of it. She doesn't want to paint herself into a corner where she's suspected of doing something more than she did.
When Crystal tells them about this, they run all the names of these individuals who supposedly are members of this gang, and no one has a criminal record of any kind.
I mean, supposedly they went from basically zero history to murder.
They're a motorcycle gang, missing a few components like a motorcycle. All those other names, and no one has a criminal record. So it's another aspect of the story that raises an eyebrow about Crystal.
We have a girl that's missing for several weeks. We start interviewing the people that lived at the house as well as other associates of theirs.
And when they came in, they all denied any sort of wrongdoing or knowledge of where Tara was at.
Mike Vessel says he has no idea about a 21 Club motorcycle gang. Doesn't even know what that is. Well, that makes two of us, Mike, because we don't know what it is either. They're getting no confirmation from anybody so far. And then they speak to DJ Meyer, the supposed enforcer.
He came in for a second interview. With DJ, I mean, my whole point was just to win his trust.
I don't know what happened.
Okay, was Tara upset with you?
Tara wasn't upset with me. Nothing I know of.
So I talked to him some more. I said, DJ, I just need you to be my witness. You need to tell me what went on.
So did Crystal do it?
I don't know.
They continue to press him because they can feel it, that he's emotional about this.
Let me push. Let me push.
You know everything you need to know.
And he becomes emotional. And he said, yes, I do know something.
I know there was an argument, but that's all I really know.
He then says that Tara and Crystal had a love-hate relationship, and they would get into arguments all the time. And on the night in question, Crystal and Tara got in a heated argument.
So what do you think? Got her so mad?
I don't know.
How did she kill her?
I don't know how she done it. I don't. I know there was blood, so I'm thinking maybe stabbed her.
What are you doing? What?
He then says Crystal grabbed a knife and stabbed her to death, and DJ's mistake was to help her cover it up.
She was panicked, told me I need to help her, so I tried to help her. But I don't remember where the body is. I'm not going to prison, right? Okay. I was scared. I never done anything like this.
So we have Crystal pointing her finger at DJ, and DJ pointing his finger back. Which finger should we believe? The detectives believe that Tara's dead by someone's hand. Crystal alleges this group of nitwits who call themselves a gang are the ones responsible. DJ says it's a simple catfight between two women. Which one's true? We'll see.
We didn't have any murder weapons. We didn't have Tara's body. So we were just hoping that we'd get lucky with finding something. So we continued doing the area searches to find Tara's body.
Anderson is the kind of detective that just won't stop. The best kind of detective. Who won't ever quit.
I figure there's 6.5, 7 billion people on the planet, and if I'm the one that was trying to help and it still didn't go right, I at least tried.
They search for days and weeks in the Wyoming border area, and they find nothing.
We're still trying to corroborate things that Crystal had said. We went out to the house where Tom Vassell, Mike Vassell, and Carly Hanchett were living outside of Nunn, Colorado.
They go see Thomas Vassell, expecting to find a hardened biker.
Tom Vassell's an unhealthy older gentleman, extremely overweight, on oxygen, pretty much stays at home. But he is also supposedly the leader of this gang.
Instead of finding a badass biker, they find Santa Claus, who's inhaling oxygen. Not exactly an inspiring look.
But this was someone we had to be careful with because Tom had a Glock stuck in the couch next to him.
He is a sick old man at the moment, but 6 pounds of pressure makes him Godzilla. That's how much pressure it takes to pull a trigger.
He claimed not to know anything about what we were talking about.
Thomas does what you would expect him to do. Yeah, my kid Mike, he's a good kid. He has some friends, they're all good kids. You want to look around, go right ahead. When Anderson and Boyle are talking to Thomas, they smell an odor from what is likely a burn pit. A lot of people that live remotely in Colorado, there's no garbage service in those remote areas. You have to burn your trash.
We did a search warrant out there, and then our field evidence technicians sifted through all the ashes.
There is no body or body parts, nothing like that. It's very difficult to destroy a human body with fire.
This looks pretty interesting.
It takes the heat generated in a crematorium to do that.
During the search, they found the back of an iPad, consistent with what Vonda had told us that Tara always had this iPad.
It's pretty suspicious. You know, who burns an iPad?
An iPad is an expensive toy. They don't burn an iPad unless it belongs to a murder victim, and that's most likely what this is. People will destroy evidence of their involvement in a crime, believing that they burn it, it's destroyed, it can't be used against them. But people look for things that people throw away, particularly guys that carry a badge.
So all of this definitely gave some value to the story that they were trying to cover up something that had been done.
We have Crystal's story about the whole gang being involved, and her charming boyfriend DJ's tale of only Crystal being involved. This burned and destroyed iPad in Thomas Vassell's burn pit is evidence of what Crystal said as being the truth, and what DJ is saying is a lie.
We got a search warrant from the phone company for all the phone records of the gang.
When those phones are recovered by the police, they discover something very intriguing.
All the different phones from all these different gang members, it appeared that for the most part, they all stopped at the same time and didn't come back on until the next day.
There was, however, one exception. Mike Vassell, the number 2 wizard of the gang, left his on.
I don't know why he left it on. Probably some level of narcissism that he's the only one that's capable of communicating if need be.
So we were able to use his phone and using towers to figure out where they went to dump Tara's dog, Diablo, which then made sense where he was found.
And then the police basically put a map on their travels, the early morning hours of Tara's murder, and also the days following where they were, what they were doing.
They discovered the route of travel from Pierce, Colorado to the Wyoming border. They see a stop in a convenience store that sells gas and is open 24 hours near the Wyoming border.
Investigators were able to locate video footage of them going to that gas station and the pickup that they were in.
And there is the 21 motorcycle gang in all their glory. All together with a dead victim in the back of the truck. It's obvious that Thomas Vassal had some level of involvement in this. At this point, there's no evidence to support that he was directly involved. He's not in the video surveillance, but everyone else is in.
So that was a big thing for us. It was huge.
There's always a moment in a case that's been a mystery up to this point that things begin to fall together. They're not all the way together yet, but there's a definite sensation that it's about to be. At this point, they've got evidence against all the players in this. This is the case.
We still didn't have Tara's body, but the detectives and I knew these guys were good for the murder. We felt we had enough to get arrest warrants for them.
What does Anderson know for sure about this group? He knows they're idiots, that's obvious. Anderson puts it out. Come get your cell phones, there was nothing of value on them, we'll give them back. Carly and Mike show up at headquarters to get their phones back and wind up wearing handcuffs instead.
Crystal was arrested at her brother's house in LaSalle. Chad Eiler was arrested without incident at his house as well. And then the U.S. Marshals took Scott into custody at a gas station. With DJ, there was 24-hour surveillance set up on him to make sure that he wasn't going anywhere. That next day, he was arrested.
Right, okay. We know exactly what happened. Okay. And what, this was all over because Tara disrespected Carly?
I guess.
He tells what happened. He confirms Crystal's story. What Crystal's been telling them. The dispute between the victim and Carly was actually true. Carly became furious when Tara demanded she turn down her music.
The group decided that they needed to punish her for the disrespect that she had shown towards Carly.
You were following orders that came from Thomas?
Yes.
Through Mike?
Yeah.
Thomas orders her to be killed for this act, and he orders DJ as the enforcer be responsible to carry it out.
I tried talking people out of it, you know, but when you're outnumbered and you got, you know, orders from the doormat, you know what I mean?
So they formed up a plan. They all got their weapon of choice. Their plan was to go up the stairs. Carly's gonna hit her with a pipe, and then everybody's gonna stab her.
Tara texted her mother in the middle of the night and told her to stay by her phone because something may happen. Crystal went into a downstairs bedroom, and then Mike had everybody else go kill Tara upstairs in Tara's bedroom.
They then confront her. Carly hits the victim over the head with a lead pipe. Then DJ stabs her with a hunting knife.
Were you straddling her when you stabbed her, or were you sitting next to her?
I can't sit there. You know, everything was a blur, you know, it's almost like it wasn't happening.
Scott sees that she is suffering from these wounds, and he decides to give her a quick death and stabs her in the spine once, resulting in her immediate demise. When they searched in the room, they found no evidence of blood, so the normal homicide that occurs by stabbing has one killer and one victim. One blade. that's driven into the victim over and over, and there's cast off from that blade. Here we have several killers. Each person has a knife, stabs once, removes the blade, it wipes through the clothing coming out that's clean, no cast off. That would explain why the house was clean from blood, because there was no cast off to find. It's not there.
From there, all the others got in the truck and loaded her and Diablo up.
It was the dog, and Tara dropped it separate times?
Yes.
Scott was supposed to kill the dog and dump the dog out in the middle of the grasslands, but he couldn't bring himself to do it, so he just kicked the dog loose.
He doesn't mind killing a human. That's not a problem. But to kill a dog, no, you can't do that.
So how far from the dog do you think Tara is?
100 miles. You know,
really?
Quite, you know, and I'm serious. I believe she's in Wyoming.
The problem remains, where is the victim? No one can remember. They're all willing to say what they know, but they don't know enough. They've got evidence against all the players in this, with the exception of Thomas Vassal. And Thomas winds up providing that evidence by talking to his kid on a recorded line inside a jail. This results in the arrest of Thomas.
Just because the leader doesn't get involved and actually do it, they can still be charged with conspiracy under the law. So that's what we did in this case.
They're found guilty of all these various crimes or sentenced to various terms. DJ is sentenced to life in prison. Everybody gets locked up.
So it was a really strong case. The finding the body, that was our main goal. To get justice the best way we can in our system for Vonda.
All I did for like 6 months was drive around, try to find Tara's body. Crystal had described a one-lane dirt road, a sign that said Laramie, and she could hear water nearby. And I went into Google Maps and found an area near that sign that appeared to match the description. And then several of us went up on a road trip up to Wyoming again. We got back in that area and gave it maybe a half-mile stretch of road. Detective Geyer and Detective Walker started on one side of that half-mile stretch, and then the rest of us went up to the other side and we just started working towards each other. We were out there for 15 or 20 minutes and then we came across the carpet.
There is Tara, laying there undisturbed for 187 days.
Sergeant Halloran at the time had cleared everybody out and just kind of let me stay there by myself for a minute. Then immediately after that, I went to find Vonda.
When he came over, he said that they're pretty sure they found her. It became very real that day. Even though it was already real, it was set in cement that day. That she wasn't coming back. I'd never talk to her again, I'd never hold her again. And that my baby was gone.
The autopsy revealed cause of death was stab wounds, manner of death was homicide.
You get very jaded in this profession. Just when you think you've seen the worst in somebody, the next person's like, hold my beer, watch this. But it's also cases like this. This is why you're in it, cases like this.
Although Tara surrounded herself with the wrong type of people, she was trying to make the right decisions, and now the world is without a good person, and that's unfortunate.
The 21 Biker Club was a dream, and nothing more than a dream. And they wind up doing this. First-degree murder. But Anderson spent 187 days of his life to find a homicide victim, to bring peace to the family, to try to find some level of justice in the world. When you do, for those few moments, all is right with the world. Next time on American Detective.
Has she ever been away this long? She never disappeared like that.
We still have no DNA. There is no body that's been found.
We were hoping these texts would prompt him to take us to the body. Whoever did this was some violent monster.
At 2:17 a.m., under a sky heavy with Texas heat, a single gunshot cut through the silence of a quiet suburban street, and in that instant, a life ended, a family was shattered, and a mystery was born, a cold case that would haunt an entire community for more than 2 decades, whispering from dark corners, lingering in forgotten files, waiting for one overlooked clue to finally tear the truth into the open. The house stood at the end of a narrow cul-de-sac, a modest 2-story building wrapped in the soft yellow glow of streetlights, the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, where neighbors recognized each other's footsteps, where the loudest sound at night was usually the hum of air conditioners struggling against the relentless summer heat. Inside, 34-year-old Laura Mitchell lay motionless on the living room floor, her blood pooling across the polished hardwood, her eyes frozen open, fixed on a ceiling fan still spinning slowly above her, as if time itself had hesitated, unsure whether to move forward. Minutes later, police sirens shattered the stillness, red and blue lights washing over manicured lawns and quiet driveways, transforming a peaceful neighborhood into the epicenter of a nightmare. Officers rushed in, weapons drawn, hearts pounding, but the killer was already gone, leaving behind only chaos, unanswered questions, and a scene that made even seasoned detectives pause in stunned silence. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no overturned furniture, just a single gunshot wound to the chest, precise and fatal, suggesting intent, control, and chilling familiarity. Laura had been alone. Her husband, Mark Mitchell, was away on a business trip, confirmed by flight records and hotel receipts. Their 6-year-old daughter was spending the night at a friend's house. Whoever had pulled the trigger knew exactly when the house would be empty, knew exactly how to enter without leaving a trace, knew exactly where to find her. The first patrol officers described the scene as eerily calm, almost staged. A half-finished cup of tea sat on the kitchen counter. A paperback novel lay open on the couch, its pages bent as if it had been dropped mid-sentence. Laura's phone rested face down beside her hand, its screen still glowing faintly with a missed call notification. No fingerprints. No weapon. No obvious struggle. Just silence, thick and suffocating. Within hours, the neighborhood was crawling with detectives, forensic teams, and crime scene analysts. Every inch of the house was combed. Walls were swabbed. Floors were scraped. Drains were examined. Trash bins were emptied. Nothing. No usable DNA. No fibers. No shoe prints. It was as if the killer had dissolved into the night. Laura Mitchell had no known enemies. She worked as a real estate agent, known for her warm smile, relentless work ethic, and dedication to her family. Friends described her as generous, dependable, and deeply loyal. Neighbors spoke of her kindness, her habit of baking cookies for new residents, her laughter echoing across backyards during weekend barbecues. To everyone who knew her, she was the last person they expected to see on a homicide report. And yet, there she was, the center of a murder investigation that would spiral into years of frustration, suspicion, and relentless uncertainty. Detectives began with the obvious. The husband. Mark Mitchell returned to Texas under police escort, his face drained of color, his eyes hollow with shock. He answered every question, provided every record, handed over his phone, his emails, his receipts. Surveillance cameras confirmed his presence in another state at the time of the murder. Multiple witnesses verified his whereabouts. The alibi was airtight. Then came the inner circle: friends, co-workers, former clients, neighbors, anyone who had ever crossed paths with Laura. Interviews stretched deep into the night. Every relationship was dissected, every disagreement magnified. Yet nothing solid emerged. No credible threats. No suspicious behavior. No motive strong enough to kill. Rumors, however, moved faster than evidence. Some whispered about a client who had lost a bidding war and blamed Laura for the deal's collapse. Others hinted at a former boyfriend from college who had resurfaced months earlier. A few even speculated about jealousy, rivalry, secret affairs. But every lead collapsed under scrutiny. Alibis held. Timelines contradicted. Suspects faded into irrelevance. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. The investigation slowed, then stalled. Media attention waned. The flashing lights disappeared. The neighborhood returned to its uneasy routine, but something fundamental had shifted. Doors were locked earlier. Porch lights stayed on longer. Parents hugged their children tighter. A silent question hovered in every mind. If this could happen here, to her, could it happen to anyone? The case file grew thick, packed with transcripts, photographs, forensic charts, and dead-end leads. It was shelved, reopened, shelved again. Each time, detectives hoped a fresh perspective might uncover what had been missed. Each time, the trail went cold. Years passed. The house where Laura died was sold, then sold again, its history buried beneath fresh paint and new furniture. Her daughter grew up with only fragments of memory and a shadow where her mother should have been. Mark moved away, unable to remain in a city that reminded him of everything he had lost. But the case never truly left the department. It lingered, an unsolved wound, a reminder of failure, a question mark etched into the collective conscience of the force. In 2015, a routine audit of cold cases brought Laura's file back to the surface. New forensic technologies had transformed criminal investigations. DNA databases had expanded. Analytical software could now find patterns once invisible to the human eye. Detectives reopened the boxes, flipping through yellowed pages, scanning fading photographs, reliving every moment of the crime as if it had happened the night before. They found nothing new. No usable DNA. No overlooked fingerprints. No lost evidence. And then, buried deep within a forgotten evidence bag, sealed and labeled almost as an afterthought, they discovered a single item that had never been fully examined, a fragment of clear adhesive tape, less than an inch long, stuck to the underside of the living room coffee table. At the time, it had seemed insignificant. A stray piece of packaging. A remnant of a shipping label. A meaningless speck in a room filled with tragedy. It had been logged, bagged, and stored, but never prioritized. Now, under the cold white glow of a forensic lab, that tiny strip of tape was peeled open, scanned, magnified, and processed with technology that did not exist in 2003. And in its faint residue, technicians detected something that made them freeze. A partial DNA profile. It wasn't enough to identify a suspect. Not yet. But it was something. For the first time in 12 years, the case had breathed again. Detectives began the slow, methodical process of rebuilding the timeline. They mapped every movement, every phone call, every transaction from the days leading up to the murder. They re-interviewed witnesses who had long assumed the case was dead. Some had moved. Some had changed names. Some were reluctant to reopen old wounds. But piece by piece, the past began to reassemble. One neighbor recalled a dark sedan idling at the end of the street shortly after midnight. Another remembered a man pacing near the sidewalk, speaking urgently into a phone. A delivery driver mentioned a late-night package drop, unusual for that area. Each detail alone meant little. Together, they formed the faint outline of a presence that had never officially existed. Investigators fed the partial DNA profile into every available database. No match. They waited. Months passed in silence, broken only by periodic rechecks and automated alerts. And then, in the spring of 2021, an algorithm flagged a potential familial link, a distant genetic cousin, incarcerated for an unrelated offense in another state. The name was unfamiliar, the record unremarkable, but the connection was undeniable. Detectives followed the thread carefully, quietly, aware that one misstep could send the suspect underground. They traced family trees, employment histories, travel records. And slowly, a shadow began to take shape. A man who had lived in Texas in 2003, who had worked briefly as a subcontractor in Laura's neighborhood, who had vanished from the area less than a week after the murder. His name was Daniel Rourke. At the time of the killing, he was 29 years old, recently divorced, drowning in debt, bouncing between short-term jobs. He had installed security systems, repaired fencing, done odd handyman work. His company records placed him on Laura Mitchell's street 3 days before her death, upgrading a neighbor's alarm system. In 2003, he had been questioned briefly and dismissed. No criminal record, no apparent motive, no direct connection to the victim. Another face in a sea of possibilities. Now, 2 decades later, he was living under a different name in a small town hundreds of miles away, blending into anonymity, carrying a secret no one suspected. As detectives closed in, they uncovered one final detail, a single overlooked clue, hiding in plain sight since the very beginning, waiting for time, technology, and relentless persistence to bring it into focus. A clue that would not just reopen the case, but shatter it wide open. And as the past surged back to life, one question echoed through the halls of the department, through the streets of that quiet Texas neighborhood, through the memories of everyone who had ever known Laura Mitchell. How could the truth have been so close, for so long, and remain unseen? The answer, waiting in the shadows, was more devastating than anyone was prepared to face. The name Daniel Rourke did not ring alarms at first. It did not leap off the page. It did not trigger memories of violent outbursts or criminal histories. Instead, it sat quietly in the margins of an aging case file, almost invisible, just another contractor who had passed briefly through a quiet Texas street in the summer of 2003, another man who had shaken hands, fixed wires, collected a paycheck, and disappeared. But now, with a fragment of DNA whispering across time, his presence began to feel less like coincidence and more like destiny tightening its grip. Detectives reopened every record linked to Rourke's short stay in the area. Payroll logs, subcontracting agreements, work orders, handwritten notes, faded invoices. Each document was scanned, cataloged, and reconstructed into a timeline that had never existed before. And within that timeline, patterns emerged. Subtle, disturbing, impossible to ignore. 3 days before Laura Mitchell was murdered, Rourke had installed a wireless security keypad at the house directly across the street. The homeowner, an elderly widow, barely remembered him, but she recalled his politeness, his soft-spoken manner, and his unusual insistence on testing the range of the wireless signal from multiple angles, stepping into neighboring yards, lingering on sidewalks, glancing repeatedly at surrounding houses as if mapping the street in his mind. At the time, it seemed like thoroughness. Now, it felt like reconnaissance. Cell phone records from 2003 were sparse, fragmented, and incomplete, but technicians managed to extract enough data to identify one critical detail. On the night of the murder, a phone registered to Rourke's former employer had pinged a tower less than 2 miles from Laura's home at 1:58 a.m., just 19 minutes before the fatal gunshot shattered the night. It was not definitive. It was not proof. But it was another thread, thin yet persistent, weaving its way toward a conclusion no one wanted to face. The deeper detectives dug, the more Rourke's past began to fracture. Former co-workers described him as reserved, intelligent, meticulous, but also deeply resentful. A man who believed life owed him something. A man who watched others carefully, measuring their success against his own failures. A man who collected grievances like trophies, storing them away, waiting for the moment they might become useful. Financial records painted a bleak picture. Crushing debt, maxed-out credit cards, Overdue loans, child support payments he could barely afford, eviction notices stacked like silent threats. He drifted from job to job, city to city, leaving behind broken leases and unresolved disputes. Everywhere he went, there were whispers, arguments with supervisors, tense exchanges with clients, complaints of inappropriate familiarity that never quite crossed the threshold of official accusations. And then there was Laura. Emails recovered from a defunct real estate firm's server revealed that, 2 weeks before her death, Laura had filed a formal complaint against an unnamed subcontractor who had behaved unprofessionally during a routine property showing. The report described unwanted attention, persistent personal questions, and an unsettling sense of being watched. The name was redacted. The original document had vanished. But the timeline aligned. The description matched. And Rourke's employment records placed him at that exact property on that exact day. The implication hit like a blow. Detectives revisited the crime scene photographs, studying every angle, every shadow, every detail once dismissed as meaningless. The lack of forced entry took on new weight. Whoever entered Laura's home had done so with confidence, familiarity, and silence. No broken locks. No shattered glass. No frantic struggle. The killer had either been invited inside or had found a way in without resistance. They examined the home's security system. Outdated. Basic. But still functional. No alarms had triggered. No alert sent. Yet technicians discovered something strange. The system logs from that night were corrupted, partially erased, as if someone had intentionally disrupted them. In 2003, the technology was crude, easily manipulated by someone with technical knowledge. Someone who installed and repaired security systems for a living. The theory began to crystallize. Rourke had been inside homes like Laura's countless times. He knew how people lived, how they secured their doors, where they had spare keys, how alarm systems failed, and how to disable them without leaving a trace. He moved invisibly between private spaces, trusted by homeowners who never imagined that the man fixing their wires might also be memorizing their routines. And Laura, with her warm demeanor and professional courtesy, had likely treated him no differently. Investigators reconstructed her final hours. That evening, she had attended a client dinner, returned home shortly after 10 p.m., and made a brief phone call to her husband before settling in for the night. Her car remained in the driveway. The porch light glowed softly. Everything appeared normal. Somewhere between midnight and 2:17 a.m., the killer arrived. A neighbor's motion-activated camera, newly installed in 2014, could not provide footage from 2003. But its position revealed something important. From the angle of Laura's driveway, the front door was completely shielded from street view. Anyone approaching would have been invisible to passing cars, hidden behind landscaping and shadow. Inside, the half-finished tea suggested interruption. The open book implied she had been relaxed, unguarded. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no defensive wounds. Laura had likely recognized the person at her door. Or she had never seen him at all. The medical examiner's report described the gunshot as precise, fired from close range, angled slightly downward, striking the heart. It was the kind of shot delivered by someone calm, controlled, and certain, not the wild discharge of a panicked intruder, not the clumsy mistake of an amateur. The weapon was never found. Ballistics linked the bullet to a rare manufacturer, a small batch supplier based in the Midwest, whose ammunition was primarily sold through specialty shops. Sales records were long gone. But detectives uncovered something unexpected, a decade-old firearms forum post, archived and forgotten, in which a user with a username eerily similar to Rourke's former online handle had discussed testing that exact brand of ammunition for reliability and stopping power. The language was clinical, detached, cold. And slowly, inexorably, the picture sharpened. Yet still, there was no direct proof. No witness who could place Rourke at the scene. No camera footage. No fingerprints. Only a partial DNA profile, fragments of circumstantial evidence, and a growing certainty that the truth had been standing in front of them all along. Detectives knew they needed more. They needed Rourke's DNA. But Rourke had vanished into a maze of false identities and transient addresses. He worked under aliases, paid in cash, rented short-term apartments, avoided paperwork, lived quietly, carefully, as if permanently bracing for a knock on the door. Surveillance teams tracked him for months. They observed his routines, his habits, his vulnerabilities. They watched as he bought groceries, filled his gas tank, collected his mail. And in those mundane moments, they waited for an opportunity. It came in the form of a discarded coffee cup. One morning, outside a small roadside diner, Rourke finished his drink, crumpled the paper cup, and tossed it into a trash bin before driving away. Investigators moved quickly, retrieving the cup before it could be contaminated, sealing it in an evidence bag, and rushing it to the lab. The results arrived weeks later. The DNA matched. Not partially, not tentatively, but conclusively. The fragment of adhesive tape from beneath Laura's coffee table carried the same genetic markers as the saliva recovered from Rourke's discarded cup. The probability of a coincidental match was less than 1 in several trillion. The room fell silent. After 18 years, the cold case had a name, a face, a living, breathing suspect who had walked free for nearly 2 decades while a community mourned and a family aged in the shadow of unanswered grief. But even with the DNA, the case was not yet complete. Prosecutors demanded motive, opportunity, narrative. They needed to know not just who had killed Laura Mitchell, but why. And that answer lay buried in the darkest corners of Rourke's past, in memories he had spent a lifetime trying to erase, in a single overlooked clue that, once uncovered, would expose a chain of events more chilling than anyone could have imagined. As investigators prepared to confront him, one truth became painfully clear. This was never a random act, never a crime of impulse. It was the final chapter of a story that had begun long before Laura ever knew his name. And the deeper they looked, the more terrifying that story became. The moment the DNA confirmation arrived, the case transformed from a lingering ghost into a living, breathing pursuit, and every detail that had once seemed ordinary now pulsed with new meaning, each fragment of evidence rearranging itself into a pattern that could no longer be denied. Daniel Rourke was no longer a shadow at the edge of the investigation. He was its center. And as detectives began to peel back the layers of his life, they discovered a past steeped in quiet obsession, buried resentment, and a trail of unresolved encounters that pointed relentlessly toward a single, fatal conclusion. Rourke's early years offered few obvious warnings. Born in a fading industrial town, he grew up amid the slow decay of factories and storefronts, surrounded by adults who spoke often of lost opportunities and broken promises. Teachers described him as bright, withdrawn, methodical, a boy who observed more than he participated, who kept meticulous notebooks filled with diagrams, lists, and cryptic reflections. Classmates remembered his intensity, the way his eyes lingered too long, the unsettling calm that seemed to settle around him like a shroud. In adolescence, that intensity hardened. He gravitated toward electronics, surveillance equipment, mechanical systems. He dismantled radios, rewired doorbells, modified alarm systems. By his early 20s, he had turned those skills into employment, drifting between security firms and independent contracting work, always searching for the next opportunity, the next paycheck, the next temporary foothold. But stability never followed. Jobs ended abruptly. Relationships collapsed. Resentment fermented. Friends from that period recalled his fixation on control. He spoke often of how easily people could be manipulated, how blind they were to the vulnerabilities in their own lives. He prided himself on noticing what others overlooked: spare keys hidden beneath flower pots, unlocked windows on second floors, predictable routines that turned private spaces into open invitations. To him, these were not warnings. They were revelations. As investigators reconstructed Rourke's movements in the months leading up to Laura Mitchell's murder, an unsettling chronology emerged. He had crossed paths with her not once, but twice. The first encounter occurred during a routine home showing, where he was assigned to verify the functionality of a newly installed alarm system. Laura, professional and courteous, had escorted him through the property. According to notes she later filed, his questions quickly shifted from technical to personal. Was she married? Did she live nearby? Was she often home alone? She deflected politely, completed the tour, and filed her complaint that same evening. The second encounter happened weeks later, when Rourke's work brought him to Laura's own neighborhood. He installed equipment for her elderly neighbor, lingering longer than necessary, glancing repeatedly toward Laura's house. At the time, no one thought to question it. Now, it felt deliberate, calculated. Detectives interviewed the widow again, this time with photographs, timelines, and renewed urgency. She remembered Rourke standing at her front window, staring across the street, asking casual questions about who lived there, whether the family traveled often, if the husband worked late. She answered without suspicion. Why would she doubt the man hired to protect her home? Every answer she gave, every casual detail, may have been another piece in a puzzle Rourke was assembling in silence. Investigators examined Rourke's financial desperation during that period. He was days away from eviction. His bank account hovered near zero. His credit cards were maxed. But the murder yielded no stolen property, no missing valuables, no financial gain. Whatever drove him that night, it was not money. The motive lay elsewhere. Psychological profilers were brought in, combing through transcripts, emails, and witness statements. They identified patterns of entitlement, grievance, and obsession. Rourke did not merely desire control, he demanded it. Rejection, especially from women he perceived as successful or independent, triggered intense internal reactions. To him, refusal was not a boundary. It was an insult. Laura's complaint, buried in company files and never forwarded to law enforcement, now took on devastating significance. It was not just documentation. It was a warning that had gone unheard. And then there was the tape. For years, that tiny fragment had been dismissed as meaningless debris. But forensic specialists now recognized its texture, its adhesive composition, its manufacturing signature. It was not packaging tape. It was a specific brand of industrial-grade adhesive used by security technicians to secure loose wiring inside control panels, a brand distributed almost exclusively through trade suppliers. In 2003, Rourke's employer had purchased that exact tape in bulk. The piece found beneath Laura's coffee table bore microscopic impressions consistent with the inside of a wireless keypad casing. It suggested that the tape had once been wrapped around internal components, then torn away hastily, perhaps to disable or bypass the system. In other words, the overlooked clue was not just DNA. It was evidence of method. The killer had entered Laura's home by manipulating her security system, using professional tools, moving with practiced efficiency, leaving behind only the smallest trace, a fragment too insignificant to matter at the time, too subtle to draw attention, too easily ignored. But now it screamed. Investigators reenacted the sequence. Rourke approaches the house, aware that Laura is alone. He disables the alarm, perhaps already knowing the access code from prior observation. He enters quietly. Laura, hearing movement, emerges from the kitchen, confused but unafraid. She recognizes him, perhaps vaguely, perhaps as the man who fixed her neighbor's system. He speaks calmly, steps closer, produces the weapon. There is no struggle. The gun fires. And in that instant, his imagined power becomes irrevocable reality. The theory was chilling. But theories do not secure convictions. Detectives needed Rourke to speak. They began with subtle pressure. Old acquaintances were contacted. Former employers were questioned. Financial institutions were subpoenaed. The walls around Rourke's carefully constructed anonymity began to close in. He sensed the shift. Friends noticed his agitation. Coworkers described sudden paranoia, erratic behavior, abrupt absences. Surveillance teams reported that he began altering his routines, switching vehicles, avoiding familiar locations. He stopped eating at his usual diner. He started discarding personal items in random trash bins across multiple towns, a futile attempt to erase his biological trail. The net tightened. Finally, in late autumn, detectives approached him. The interview room was sterile, fluorescent lit, stripped of comfort. Rourke sat across from two investigators, his hands folded neatly on the table, his expression guarded, composed. He denied knowing Laura Mitchell, denied being in her neighborhood that night, denied any involvement.
His voice was steady,
his gaze unwavering. They placed the evidence before him, one piece at a time. The payroll records, the neighbor's testimony, the corrupted alarm logs, the ballistics forum post, the adhesive tape, and finally the DNA. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, imperceptibly, something shifted behind his eyes. But he did not confess. Instead, he retreated into silence, invoking his right to counsel, ending the interview with a single sentence that lingered in the air long after he was led away. You can't prove what you can't see. Yet the prosecutors believed they could. An arrest warrant was issued. Rourke was taken into custody, charged with the murder of Laura Mitchell, and transported back to Texas in chains. News of the arrest exploded across media outlets, reigniting a case many had long abandoned. Headlines blazed. Social networks erupted. The quiet street where Laura had died once again swarmed with cameras, microphones, and whispered speculation. For her family, the arrest was both relief and agony. Relief that the truth might finally surface. Agony that the wound, long scarred over, had been torn open once more. As Rourke awaited trial, investigators continued digging, searching for corroboration, patterns, prior offenses that might confirm their narrative. What they uncovered suggested that Laura Mitchell may not have been the only woman to cross his path, and that the crime committed in 2003 might have been the culmination of a far darker history. And as the walls of his past crumbled, a new fear began to take shape, that the cold case cracked open in Texas was merely the first of many, and that the full scope of Daniel Rourke's actions had yet to be revealed. The arrest did not bring closure. It ignited a deeper unease, a tremor that rippled through every department involved, because as Daniel Rourke sat alone in a Texas detention cell, the question no one dared to ask out loud began to echo with terrifying persistence. If he was capable of this, then how many times had he done it before, and how many times had he come frighteningly close without ever being caught? The investigation widened overnight, stretching beyond state lines, beyond familiar faces, beyond the comfort of known boundaries. Detectives compiled a map of Rourke's life, pinning cities, towns, temporary addresses, short-term contracts, and unexplained gaps across nearly 2 decades. The result was a sprawling constellation of movement, a restless trajectory that crossed more than a dozen states, each stop lasting just long enough to leave an impression, never long enough to leave roots. Former employers were contacted. Old coworkers were tracked down. Rental agencies, storage facilities, credit bureaus, and utility companies were subpoenaed. Every trace of Rourke's existence was pulled into the light, examined for anomalies, patterns, and shadows. And in those shadows, unsettling stories began to surface. In Arizona, a woman recalled a break-in that had never made sense. Nothing stolen, no vandalism, just the eerie certainty that someone had been inside her home while she slept. In Colorado, a college student reported a man watching her from the shadows outside her apartment for weeks before vanishing without explanation. In Missouri, a security firm documented multiple unauthorized system overrides during Rourke's employment, dismissed at the time as technical glitches. In Nevada, a landlord described finding meticulously arranged surveillance notes in an abandoned apartment, detailing the daily routines of neighboring tenants. None of these incidents were crimes in isolation. No bodies. No undeniable proof. Just fragments of fear, scattered across geography and time, too thin to form a case, too persistent to ignore. Psychological profilers reviewed the material, tracing the arc of Rourke's behavior. They spoke of escalation, of fixation, of a gradual erosion of boundaries that often precedes catastrophic violence. In their assessment, Laura's murder was not an anomaly. It was an apex. They reconstructed his likely internal narrative, a man who believed himself invisible, superior, untouchable. A man who derived power not merely from control, but from secrecy. Each unnoticed trespass, each unreported intrusion, each quiet victory reinforced the belief that he could move through other people's lives like a ghost, unseen and unchallenged. Until, finally, someone saw him. Laura had not just rejected him. She had documented him, reduced him to a complaint form, placed his behavior into a system where it could be examined, judged, and condemned. To Rourke, that was not merely professional. It was existential. And in that perception, the motive crystallized with horrifying clarity. As the prosecution prepared its case, they built a narrative that unfolded like a slow, methodical descent. They described a man cornered not by circumstance, but by his own growing compulsion. A man whose obsession metastasized until violence became, in his mind, inevitable. Meanwhile, the defense crafted a counterstory: coincidence, contamination, investigative tunnel vision. They challenged the chain of custody of the tape, questioned the reliability of decades-old recollections, cast doubt on the DNA collection process. They portrayed Rourke as a victim of technological overreach, a convenient suspect trapped by statistical probability rather than certainty. The courtroom became a battlefield of science and psychology, memory and doubt. Yet outside, the public narrative hardened quickly. To many, the evidence felt overwhelming. The overlooked clue, the tiny fragment of tape, had become a symbol of justice delayed, a reminder that even the smallest detail could carry the weight of truth. Laura Mitchell's story resurfaced across screens and headlines. Old photographs circulated. Friends spoke publicly for the first time. Neighbors recounted the night that changed everything. And her daughter, now an adult, stood before cameras with trembling resolve, demanding accountability, not vengeance, but acknowledgement. The trial approached. In preparation, detectives re-examined the original crime scene, revisiting the house that had once been the epicenter of terror. Though renovated and repainted, its bones remained the same. The layout unchanged. The angles preserved. They walked the rooms, reenacting the final moments, aligning evidence with physical reality, ensuring that no assumption went untested. They measured distances, traced sight lines, calculated timing, and in doing so, they uncovered a chilling consistency. The sequence of events required to commit the murder aligned perfectly with the skills, habits, and tools of a trained security technician. Every motion was efficient, every step purposeful. There was no hesitation, no chaos, only precision. That precision, investigators believed, was Rourke's signature. As the trial began, the courtroom filled with tension thick enough to taste. Reporters crowded the aisles. Cameras lined the walls. Laura's family sat rigid in the front row, clutching one another, bracing for a journey back into the worst night of their lives. Rourke entered in a plain suit, his face unreadable, his posture composed. To the casual observer, he looked ordinary, almost forgettable, and that, perhaps, was the most unsettling detail of all. The prosecution opened with the overlooked clue, the tape fragment that had bridged 18 years of silence. They described its discovery, its analysis, its genetic revelation. They guided the jury through the labyrinth of evidence, building a mosaic of presence, opportunity, and motive. Each piece locked into place with deliberate care. Expert witnesses explained the science of DNA recovery, the improbability of contamination, the astronomical odds against random match. Technicians detailed the vulnerabilities of early 2000s alarm systems, demonstrating how a knowledgeable intruder could disable them in seconds. Psychologists outlined behavioral patterns consistent with stalking, obsession, and retaliatory violence. One by one, the walls around Rourke tightened. But the defense fought relentlessly. They cross-examined with surgical precision, probing for inconsistencies, seeding doubt, emphasizing the absence of eyewitnesses, the lack of direct forensic links beyond the tape. They argued that the narrative relied too heavily on inference, too deeply on reconstructed memory, too comfortably on assumption. And for a time, uncertainty lingered. Then came the testimony that shifted the atmosphere irreversibly. A former coworker, long reluctant to come forward, took the stand. He described an incident weeks before the murder, when Rourke had erupted in rage after receiving a reprimand from a female client. He recalled Rourke muttering about humiliation, about being dismissed, about making people understand consequences. At the time, it had sounded like venting. Now, it felt like prophecy. Another witness, a former girlfriend, recounted episodes of possessiveness, emotional manipulation, and covert surveillance. She described discovering hidden cameras in her apartment, installed without her knowledge, positioned to monitor her movements. When confronted, Rourke had dismissed it as curiosity, as technical experimentation. She left him days later. The courtroom fell silent. Each story added weight. Each recollection sharpened the outline of a man capable of calculated intrusion, emotional control, and, ultimately, lethal retaliation. Yet still, the question of why that night, that moment, that trigger, hung in the air. And then, deep within archived corporate files, investigators uncovered a final, devastating piece of context, an internal email chain from Laura's real estate firm, dated 10 days before her death. In it, Laura pressed management to escalate her complaint, expressing concern for her safety, noting that the subcontractor had learned too much about her schedule, her address, her routines. Her final sentence lingered like an echo across time. "I don't feel safe knowing he knows where I live." Those words landed in the courtroom with the force of a gunshot. Suddenly, the narrative was complete. The overlooked clue had not just exposed the killer. It had revealed the warning that went unheard, the danger that went unaddressed, the fatal gap between intuition and action. And as the jury absorbed the weight of that realization, the community confronted a haunting truth. The cold case was never just about a murderer who escaped justice. It was about how easily evil can hide in plain sight, how silently it can wait, and how devastating the cost can be when it is finally allowed to act. The verdict loomed, and with it, the final reckoning of a story that had begun in silence and now thundered toward its inevitable conclusion. The courtroom seemed to shrink as the weight of testimony accumulated, each statement compressing the air, tightening the silence, until even the smallest movement sounded like an intrusion. Every face in the gallery reflected a different shade of tension: fear, anticipation, exhaustion, hope, but all were bound by the same unspoken understanding. This was no longer just a trial, it was a reckoning, a collision between past and present, between the fragile memory of a woman and the cold persistence of a man who had erased her from the world. Daniel Rourke sat unmoving, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall, as if staring into a future he could no longer outrun. The evidence assembled against him was not a single overwhelming blow, but a relentless tide, wave after wave of detail, circumstance, and scientific certainty, eroding every claim of coincidence. Yet he remained composed, almost serene, as though the storm unfolding around him belonged to someone else. Prosecutors continued their methodical march, reconstructing the final 48 hours of Laura Mitchell's life with surgical precision. They mapped her movements across the city, traced her phone calls, reassembled her emails, and synchronized her routine with Rourke's known whereabouts. The timelines overlapped with eerie consistency, converging toward that narrow window in the early hours of the morning when everything changed. They described Laura's evening: the polite dinner with clients, the casual laughter, the brief phone call to her husband, the simple rituals of home, setting down her keys, slipping off her shoes, heating water for tea, opening a book. Ordinary actions, rendered tragic by hindsight. Each detail reminded the jury that this was not an abstract crime. It was the violent interruption of a real life, unfolding in real time. Then they turned to the night itself. Through expert testimony and digital reconstruction, they recreated the approach to Laura's house, the precise angles of shadow, the blind spots concealed by hedges and architectural design. They demonstrated how the alarm system could be bypassed, how the adhesive tape fragment fit into the mechanism, how the corrupted log files aligned with the moment of intrusion. The scene materialized in the jurors' minds like a grim blueprint, a sequence of motions that left no room for chaos, no margin for error. And in that calculated choreography, Rourke's presence became undeniable. The defense objected relentlessly, challenging every inference, every reconstructed moment, every psychological interpretation. They warned against the dangers of narrative seduction, against the human tendency to impose meaning on coincidence. They reminded the jury that certainty is not the same as truth, and that the absence of alternative explanations does not constitute proof. Yet the prosecution had anticipated this. They introduced behavioral analysts who spoke not of speculation, but of patterns, documented, peer-reviewed sequences of escalation observed in offenders who transition from voyeurism to intrusion, from intrusion to domination, from domination to violence. They traced those patterns through Rourke's documented history, the unauthorized system overrides, the surveillance notes, the hidden cameras, the persistent personal inquiries, the obsessive tracking of routines. Each element alone could be dismissed. Together, they formed a trajectory. And at the end of that trajectory stood Laura. As days of testimony blurred into one another, the emotional toll on Laura's family became visible. Her husband sat rigid, hands clenched, eyes fixed forward, absorbing each detail like a physical blow. Her daughter, now grown, listened in silence, her face a careful mask, as strangers described her mother's final moments in forensic detail. The distance of time offered no protection. If anything, it deepened the wound, layering years of unanswered grief atop fresh revelation. When the prosecution rested, the defense took its turn. They called their own experts, dissecting DNA probabilities, highlighting potential contamination pathways, emphasizing the limitations of partial profiles. They questioned the reliability of memories stretched across decades, the suggestibility of witnesses exposed to media coverage, the fragility of digital reconstructions built upon imperfect data. They painted Rourke as a victim of convergence, a man whose technical skills and transient lifestyle made him an easy target once the investigation latched onto his name. They suggested that the tape fragment could have been transferred indirectly, that the neighbor's testimony had evolved unconsciously over time, that confirmation bias had shaped the narrative long before the first question was asked. And for a moment, doubt resurfaced. But the prosecution's final witness shattered that fragile equilibrium. A forensic statistician, renowned for his work in cold case resolution, stepped forward to contextualize the DNA evidence. He explained, in stark, accessible terms, the astronomical improbability of the match occurring by chance, the safeguards employed to prevent contamination, the rigorous chain of custody that had preserved the tape fragment across 18 years. He dismantled the defense's hypotheticals with mathematical certainty, replacing speculation with numbers too vast to ignore. When he concluded, the courtroom was silent. Closing arguments arrived like a storm. The prosecution spoke of responsibility, not just legal, but moral. They invoked Laura's words, her expressed fear, her unheeded warning. They described a man who believed he could exist beyond consequence, who exploited trust, who weaponized knowledge, who silenced a woman because she dared to document his behavior. They urged the jury to see beyond technicalities, to recognize the human truth embedded within the evidence. The defense countered with restraint, cautioning against emotional reasoning, reminding jurors that the burden of proof lay entirely with the state, that doubt, however small, must favor the accused. They framed the case as a testament to investigative persistence, not necessarily investigative accuracy, and warned of the irreversible consequences of error. When the jury withdrew, the courtroom exhaled. Hours stretched into days. Outside, the world waited. News vans lined the streets. Commentators debated probabilities. Social media fractured into camps of certainty and skepticism. Laura's name trended once more, accompanied by images of her smile, frozen in time, juxtaposed against the cold geometry of court diagrams and forensic charts. Inside the jury room, 12 strangers grappled with the weight of irreversible decision. They replayed testimony, re-examined exhibits, questioned assumptions, debated probabilities. Each carried their own thresholds of certainty, their own definitions of reasonable doubt. And slowly, painstakingly, consensus began to form. When they returned, The air seemed to thicken, every breath suspended in anticipation. The verdict was read.
Guilty.
The word echoed, reverberating through the courtroom, across the years, into the silent spaces left behind by Laura's absence. Her family wept, a release of tension held for nearly 2 decades. Reporters scribbled furiously. Observers stared, stunned. And Daniel Rourke, for the first time since his arrest, reacted. His composure fractured. For a brief instant, rage, disbelief, and something dangerously close to triumph flickered across his face, as if the acknowledgement of his guilt, the validation of his long-hidden power, carried its own perverse satisfaction. Then the moment passed. The mask returned. He was led away in silence. Sentencing followed weeks later. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A judicial declaration that the harm inflicted could never be undone, only contained. Yet even as the courtroom doors closed, the story refused to settle. Investigators, emboldened by the conviction, continued to examine Rourke's past, reopening unresolved incidents across multiple states. Cold case units began cross-referencing timelines, searching for unsolved crimes that aligned with his movements. Families of missing women stepped forward, their hopes rekindled, their fears resurfacing. The ripple effects spread outward, unsettling a nation forced to confront the possibility that one man's hidden life had intersected with countless others, leaving invisible scars in its wake. And in quiet moments, far from cameras and courtrooms, Laura's family faced a different reckoning, the knowledge that justice, however definitive, could not restore what had been lost. The house remained empty of her presence. Holidays passed without her voice. Milestones unfolded without her guidance. Closure, they learned, was not an end. It was a fragile truce with memory. Yet within that fragile truce lay a measure of peace. Because at last, the silence had been broken. The overlooked clue had spoken. And the truth, long buried beneath time and neglect, had finally risen into the light. The conviction should have marked the end, the final period at the close of a long and harrowing sentence, but instead, it became the beginning of a deeper unease, a lingering tremor that refused to fade. Because as the echoes of the verdict settled into the walls of the courtroom, investigators across the country began to ask the same question in hushed voices. If Daniel Rourke had lived a double life for nearly 2 decades, how many shadows still lay hidden behind his carefully constructed anonymity? Boxes of archived case files were reopened. Unsolved break-ins, unexplained intrusions, vanished women, cold leads that had withered under the weight of time, all were re-examined through the lens of Rourke's newly uncovered history. His movements became coordinates on a map of possibility, each town a potential chapter, each year a corridor of unanswered questions. Patterns emerged. In 2004, a year after Laura's murder, a young woman in New Mexico reported waking to find her bedroom window open, her alarm system disabled, and muddy footprints leading away into the desert. Nothing was stolen. No confrontation occurred. But the violation lingered, a silent trauma that reshaped her sense of safety. At the time, police suspected a transient burglar. Now, Rourke's employment records placed him just miles away. In 2007, in rural Oklahoma, a single mother vanished without trace. Her home showed signs of careful intrusion, no forced entry, no disorder. Only the faint smear of adhesive residue near the control panel of her security system. The case went cold within months. Rourke had been contracted to upgrade alarms in that county the same week she disappeared. In 2010, in Northern California, a college student reported a man lurking outside her apartment, tampering with wiring near the fuse box. He fled when confronted, leaving behind a fragment of tape stuck to the siding. The evidence was logged, then lost. The suspect was never identified. Each incident alone was ambiguous. Together, they formed a constellation of fear. Task forces assembled. Jurisdictions coordinated. Data analysts fed decades of unsolved cases into predictive models, searching for overlaps in geography, methodology, and timing. The algorithms returned clusters of probability, not certainty, but enough to warrant renewed investigation. And with each reopened file, families long resigned to silence felt the stirrings of hope. Yet the deeper detectives ventured into Rourke's past, the more elusive he became. His use of aliases, cash payments, and short-term leases had erased many of his footprints. Surveillance notes, when found, were cryptic. Diaries, if they existed, had been destroyed. Digital records were sparse. He had lived like a man preparing for erasure. Inside prison, Rourke remained silent. He declined interviews, refused psychological evaluations, rejected every attempt at dialogue. Letters sent by investigators were returned unopened. Requests for cooperation met only indifference. His conviction, it seemed, had sealed him within himself. But silence can be its own confession. Profilers interpreted his withdrawal as control, the final domain he could command. By withholding information, he dictated the boundaries of truth, ensuring that some answers would remain forever beyond reach. It was, in their assessment, the ultimate assertion of dominance. Meanwhile, Laura Mitchell's case continued to ripple outward, reshaping policies, procedures, and perceptions. Law enforcement agencies revisited protocols for handling complaints, particularly those involving inappropriate conduct by contractors and service workers. Companies re-examined their reporting systems, closing the gaps that had allowed Laura's warning to vanish into bureaucracy. Security firms updated their hiring practices, introducing stricter background checks, continuous monitoring, and mandatory behavioral training. Change arrived, but always too late for the one person who had needed it most. In the quiet aftermath, Laura's family grappled with a different burden, the weight of knowing that a simple escalation, a single follow-up, a moment of urgency might have altered everything. They resisted the temptation to dwell in that space, understanding that hindsight is a merciless judge, but the question lingered, unspoken yet omnipresent. What if someone had listened? Her daughter, now in her 20s, began speaking publicly, transforming grief into advocacy. She addressed conferences, law enforcement seminars, corporate ethics panels. She spoke of trust, of vulnerability, of the dangers embedded within routine interactions. She carried her mother's story into rooms where decisions were made, insisting that no warning be dismissed as insignificant, no discomfort minimized as overreaction. And in doing so, she reclaimed a measure of agency stolen years before. Yet for all the reform, for all the renewed vigilance, the unresolved cases haunted the margins. Each potential connection to Rourke reopened wounds, forced families back into the liminal space between hope and despair. Investigators tread carefully, aware that confirmation could deliver closure, but speculation alone could inflict fresh pain. Some leads dissolved under scrutiny. Others hardened into new lines of inquiry. In 2 cases, forensic testing revealed partial DNA profiles incompatible with Rourke, narrowing the field. In one, a degraded sample produced a tentative alignment, enough to justify further excavation of evidence long buried in storage. The process was painstaking. Years of dust, neglect, and degradation resisted easy interpretation. But persistence, the same persistence that had resurrected Laura's case, drove the work forward. And slowly, imperceptibly, the narrative expanded beyond a single tragedy, revealing the chilling possibility of a serial pattern concealed beneath decades of ordinary life. Within the prison walls, Rourke remained unmoved by the growing scrutiny. He spent his days in meticulous routine, reading technical manuals, exercising alone, maintaining a disciplined detachment from his surroundings. Guards described him as polite, distant, eerily calm. He attracted little attention, blending into the anonymity of incarceration, just as he had once blended into the anonymity of society. Yet those who studied him saw something else, a man still calculating, still observing, still controlling what little territory remained to him. In rare moments, when he believed himself unobserved, he was seen sketching diagrams on scraps of paper, floor plans, wiring schemes, abstract patterns that echoed the obsessions of his youth. Whether these drawings were memories, fantasies, or mere habit remained unknown. But their presence suggested that his inner world, the one that had culminated in violence, had never truly receded. And perhaps never would. As the years unfolded, Laura's name became synonymous with the power of perseverance, a testament to the idea that no case is ever truly closed, that even the smallest fragment can resurrect a buried truth. Her story was taught in forensic courses, referenced in legal journals, cited in debates about cold case funding and technological advancement. Yet beyond the academic and procedural, beyond the statistics and policy reforms, there remained the raw, human core of the tragedy, a woman who had sensed danger, who had spoken, who had trusted that her voice would matter. And in that trust, she had been betrayed. The overlooked clue, the fragment of tape, had ultimately exposed a killer. But it also illuminated a deeper failure, the peril of ignoring the quiet signals that precede catastrophe. As investigators continued to sift through Rourke's past, they understood that some answers might never surface, that some victims might remain nameless, that some truths would remain sealed within a man who had mastered the art of disappearance. Yet they pressed on, driven not by certainty, but by obligation. Because in the shadowed spaces between what is known and what is lost, the echoes of Laura Mitchell's final warning still resounded, urging them forward, demanding vigilance, insisting that silence, however long endured, can always be broken. And in that insistence, the cold case cracked open in Texas continued to shape a future that might, one day, prevent another voice from being extinguished in the dark. Time did not soften the impact of the case.
It sharpened it.
With each passing year, the story of Laura Mitchell transformed from a singular tragedy into a warning etched into the institutional memory of law enforcement, a case study in how silence, neglect, and the smallest overlooked detail can converge into irreversible catastrophe. And yet, even as her name became synonymous with perseverance and reform, the unanswered questions surrounding Daniel Rourke's past continued to gnaw at the edges of certainty, refusing to settle into quiet resolution. Cold case units across the country began to work in concert, sharing databases, cross-referencing forensic results, mapping timelines with renewed urgency. Rourke's movements were charted like seismic activity, his presence leaving faint tremors in towns that had long since returned to routine. Investigators revisited old reports, dusted off yellowed transcripts, replayed recorded interviews with ears now trained to hear what had once gone unnoticed. In Utah, detectives reopened a 2005 case involving a woman who had vanished after reporting repeated disturbances in her home. Unexplained noises, malfunctioning locks, a sense of being watched that no one could substantiate. Her disappearance had been ruled voluntary, her belongings left behind, her bank account untouched. But Rourke's employment records placed him in that same city during the weeks preceding her last confirmed sighting. A re-examination of the crime scene photographs revealed something previously dismissed as environmental debris, a fragment of clear tape, half buried beneath a baseboard. The pattern was too precise to ignore. In Kansas, a 2008 break-in report resurfaced, filed by a newly divorced woman who claimed someone had entered her home repeatedly, rearranging objects, leaving subtle signs of intrusion. Police had found no evidence of forced entry. The case was closed as paranoia. Now, technicians reviewed the old evidence bags and discovered adhesive residue on the security keypad, consistent with the same industrial tape linked to Laura's murder. In Oregon, a family revisited the unsolved disappearance of their teenage daughter, last seen walking home from a late shift at a grocery store.
No witnesses. No suspects.
Just a silent vanishing. Cell tower data, once too limited to be useful, was reprocessed using modern algorithms, revealing a transit device moving along the same route at the same time, a device later linked to an alias used by Rourke in that period. Each revelation sent a shockwave through the investigative teams, intensifying the urgency, magnifying the stakes. What had once seemed like isolated anomalies now aligned into a chilling continuum, a long arc of predation that stretched across state lines and years, concealed beneath a veneer of technical employment and social invisibility. Yet proof remained elusive. Forensic degradation, Lost evidence, compromised scenes. The relentless erosion of time had devoured many of the answers investigators sought. In some cases, the only remnants were faded photographs, brittle reports, and the memories of witnesses who no longer trusted their own recollections. And through it all, Daniel Rourke remained silent. Requests for interviews were denied. Appeals to conscience went unanswered. Offers of reduced privileges, additional visitation rights, even the possibility of limited leniency in sentencing conditions yielded nothing. He retreated deeper into himself, an island of detachment surrounded by concrete and steel. Psychologists speculated that his silence was not merely defiance, but strategy, a calculated preservation of power. By withholding the truth, he maintained dominance over the narrative, dictating which stories would be told and which would remain forever buried. In that control, they believed, lay the last vestige of his identity. For the families of the missing, the uncertainty was unbearable. Some clung to hope, interpreting every new lead as a promise of resolution. Others braced for disappointment, wary of reopening wounds only to face fresh ambiguity. Support groups formed, bound together by shared absence, by the collective weight of not knowing. They gathered in church basements and community centers, exchanging stories, photographs, fragments of memory, constructing a mosaic of lives interrupted. Laura's daughter attended many of these meetings, listening more than she spoke, absorbing the echoes of grief that mirrored her own. She recognized in their voices the same fragile balance between endurance and despair, the same relentless yearning for answers, however painful. And in those rooms, she understood that her mother's story was not isolated. It was part of a larger, darker tapestry woven from countless silent threads. Advocacy organizations took notice. Funding for cold case investigations increased. Grants were issued for advanced forensic testing. New legislation expanded the scope of DNA collection and retention. The mechanisms of justice, once sluggish, began to accelerate, propelled by public demand and technological possibility. But progress carried its own cruelty. Each reopened case forced families to relive their worst moments, to revisit scenes they had spent years trying to forget. The promise of closure was intoxicating, but the cost was profound. Some chose not to participate, preferring the uncertain peace of ambiguity to the renewed agony of hope. Others could not turn away. In Montana, the parents of a woman missing since 2006 authorized the exhumation of remains once deemed unrelated. DNA testing revealed a partial match to Rourke's profile, not definitive, but suggestive enough to justify deeper inquiry. The process stretched on for months, each day suspended between revelation and despair. In Arizona, a woman who had survived a late-night intrusion finally agreed to speak publicly, her voice trembling as she described waking to find a man standing in her doorway, motionless, watching. He fled before she could scream. For years, she had dismissed the memory as nightmare. Now, she wondered if she had glimpsed the face of a killer who would go on to take another life. Her testimony ignited renewed scrutiny, but without physical evidence, it remained an echo, haunting but unprovable. And so, the investigation advanced in uneven surges, moments of clarity punctuated by long stretches of silence. Each potential breakthrough carried the weight of expectation. Each setback reopened the chasm of uncertainty. Through it all, the story of Laura Mitchell remained the gravitational center, the fixed point around which every inquiry revolved. Her case was the anchor, the proof that persistence could shatter even the most entrenched silence. It was the reminder that truth, however delayed, could still emerge. Yet it also stood as a testament to the terrible cost of delay. In private moments, investigators reflected on the fragility of justice, on the countless variables that determine whether a crime is solved or forgotten. They spoke of the randomness of evidence, the accidents of preservation, the improbable survival of a single fragment of tape that had outlived technological eras, bureaucratic indifference, and the erosion of time. That fragment, no longer than a fingernail, had become a symbol of oversight, of resilience, of the thin lines separating obscurity from revelation. And as the years unfolded, its legacy deepened. Training academies incorporated the case into their curricula, emphasizing the importance of meticulous documentation, of respecting every detail, no matter how insignificant it appeared. Prosecutors cited it as evidence of the power of cold case funding. Victim advocacy groups referenced it as proof that voices, even when ignored, could eventually reshape reality. Yet for those most intimately bound to the story, the resolution remained incomplete. Because beyond the verdict, beyond the reforms, beyond the renewed investigations, there persisted the haunting possibility that some truths would never surface, that some victims would never be named, that some families would never receive the clarity they so desperately sought. And in that unresolved space, the shadow of Daniel Rourke continued to stretch, long and indistinct, across a landscape of memory and loss. He sat alone in his cell, insulated from the turbulence he had unleashed, his silence a fortress no one could breach. And in that silence, the unanswered questions accumulated, heavy as gravity, waiting for a fracture that might never come. Yet hope, however fragile, endured. Because the cold case cracked open in Texas had proven one immutable truth, that even the deepest darkness can be pierced by the smallest shard of light, and that persistence, sustained across years, can force secrets into the open. And so the search continued, not driven by certainty, but by the unyielding belief that no life should vanish without witness, and no crime should be allowed the sanctuary of forgetting. In that belief, the echoes of Laura Mitchell's story pressed forward, carrying the weight of all those still waiting to be found. Winter descended with a quiet ferocity, the kind that sharpened every sound and froze every shadow into permanence, and in that stillness, the investigation reached a strange and unsettling plateau, suspended between revelation and impossibility, where each new lead promised illumination yet threatened to dissolve into uncertainty. The case had expanded beyond a single crime, beyond a single victim, beyond even a single man, becoming a sprawling labyrinth of memory, fear, and fragmented truth that stretched across decades and borders. In laboratories scattered across the country, technicians worked through the night, coaxing information from evidence that had endured years of neglect. Fibers once dismissed as dust were re-examined under advanced microscopes. Degraded DNA samples were subjected to cutting-edge sequencing techniques capable of extracting genetic whispers from almost nothing. Old audio recordings were filtered, cleaned, and enhanced, uncovering subtle inflections in voices that had long faded into static. Every breakthrough, no matter how small, carried the potential to collapse years of silence. In a converted warehouse in Colorado, forensic analysts uncovered a partial fingerprint from a 2006 intrusion case, preserved only because an evidence technician had refused to discard it despite orders to purge outdated materials. The print, incomplete and distorted, would have been useless years earlier. Now, algorithms reconstructed its missing contours, aligning its ridges with a probability match that drew investigators back to Rourke's timeline. It was not definitive, but it was enough to reopen doors long sealed. In New Mexico, ground-penetrating radar swept across a remote stretch of desert where Rourke had once lived in a trailer park now reclaimed by sand and scrub. The scans revealed anomalies beneath the soil, irregular shapes that suggested human interference. Excavation followed, careful and reverent, each shovel of earth a descent into possibility. They found remnants of clothing, fragments of bone, enough to confirm a life, not enough to confirm a name. For a family waiting more than 15 years, it was both devastation and deliverance. The pattern of discovery intensified, accelerating with a momentum that seemed almost supernatural. Investigators spoke of a tipping point, a moment when accumulated persistence finally overcame entropy. Each recovered fragment sharpened the silhouette of Rourke's hidden life, revealing a shadow that stretched far beyond the boundaries of the crime that had first exposed him. Yet even as evidence mounted, a disquieting realization settled in. The deeper they went, the more likely it became that the full scope of his actions would never be known. Too much time had passed. Witnesses had died. Landscapes had changed. Structures had been demolished. Records had been purged. The world had moved on, indifferent to the quiet suffering it left behind. Every lost detail was a door permanently closed, every missing file a voice forever silenced. And still, they pressed forward. In the absence of confession, investigators turned to behavior, to reconstructing the inner logic of a man who had lived between visibility and concealment. They examined his routines, his obsessions, his patterns of migration, searching for rhythms that might predict where his secrets lay buried. One detail emerged with unsettling consistency. Rourke favored transitional spaces, neighborhoods in flux, temporary housing, developing suburbs, transient work zones. Places where people came and went, where anonymity flourished, where disruption could vanish into the churn of change. It was within these liminal environments that he seemed most comfortable, most active, most dangerous. He gravitated toward women who lived alone, who maintained predictable schedules, who occupied homes protected by security systems he understood intimately. He studied routines. He memorized vulnerabilities. He exploited trust. And when control faltered, when rejection pierced his self-image, he escalated. Profilers mapped this escalation across time, charting a progression from voyeurism to intrusion, from intrusion to confrontation, from confrontation to annihilation. Laura's murder marked the apex, the moment when his need for dominance crystallized into irreversible action. Yet the echoes of that need reverberated backward, illuminating a trail of near misses and unresolved threats. The implications were staggering. Each reopened case raised the possibility of additional victims, additional families bound to uncertainty, additional stories that might never be told. The investigation became a moral imperative as much as a legal one, a collective refusal to allow silence to stand in for truth. Public attention surged and receded in cycles, driven by breakthroughs and stymied by setbacks. Documentaries aired. Podcasts dissected timelines. Forums erupted with speculation, crowdsourcing theories, and amateur analyses. Some contributions proved invaluable, surfacing obscure details long buried in personal memory. Others introduced noise, distraction, and dangerous conjecture. Through it all, authorities struggled to balance transparency with caution, aware that premature conclusions could devastate families already perched on the edge of hope. Inside prison, Rourke remained untouched by the turbulence he had unleashed. He declined all communication, rejected therapy, spurned offers of dialogue. Even when confronted with evidence of additional potential victims, he displayed no reaction, no curiosity, no remorse. To observers, his detachment bordered on the inhuman, as though his emotional core had calcified long before his arrest. Yet psychologists cautioned against mistaking silence for emptiness. They spoke of internal landscapes so rigidly controlled that any admission of vulnerability would threaten collapse. In their assessment, Rourke's refusal to engage was not apathy, but survival, the preservation of a fragile internal order constructed atop denial and rationalization. In rare glimpses, when guards overheard fragments of his muttered soliloquies, they described technical monologues, intricate descriptions of circuitry and spatial design, abstract meditations on efficiency and structure. It was as if he sought refuge in the precision of systems, retreating from the chaos of human consequence. For Laura's family, these revelations offered little comfort. They lived within a paradox, grateful that her killer had been identified, yet burdened by the knowledge that her death may have been part of a broader pattern of violence. Each new discovery reopened grief, reframing her story within a larger narrative of loss. Her daughter, now an advocate for survivors, wrestled with conflicting impulses to honor her mother's singularity, to preserve the intimacy of her memory, and to contribute to a collective reckoning that might prevent future tragedies. In speeches and interviews, she spoke of resilience, of vigilance, of the necessity of listening when discomfort arises. But in private, she mourned the erosion of simplicity, the way her mother's life had become a symbol, a lesson, a cautionary tale. And still, the investigation continued. In a rural county in Arkansas, authorities unearthed a cache of personal items hidden beneath the floorboards of a long-abandoned rental property: jewelry, photographs, handwritten notes, fragments of clothing. No direct link to Rourke could be established, yet his rental history placed him in that very house during the years those items vanished from local homes. Each artifact whispered of presence, of intrusion, of lives intersecting with a man who left nothing behind but unease. The absence of certainty became its own form of torment. Investigators grappled with the limits of knowledge, the boundaries beyond which truth dissolves into speculation. They confronted the possibility that some answers might remain forever out of reach, sealed within the mind of a man who refused to speak and the eroded landscapes of a past that could not be fully reconstructed. Yet within that uncertainty, a fragile hope endured. That persistence, sustained across years, could still coax fragments of truth into the light, that each recovered detail, however small, could restore dignity to lives long overshadowed by absence. As winter gave way to spring, and spring to another relentless summer, the cold case cracked open in Texas continued to reverberate, its echoes shaping investigations, policies, and personal journeys far beyond its origin. And in the quiet spaces between breakthroughs, when the noise of headlines faded and the machinery of justice slowed, the story of Laura Mitchell lingered, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, a single overlooked clue could transform silence into revelation and grief into a relentless pursuit of truth. The question that remained, heavy and unresolved, was not whether justice had been served. It was how much of the truth still lay hidden, waiting for a moment, a fragment, a chance to speak. The longer the investigation stretched, the more the boundaries between past and present began to dissolve, until time itself felt unstable, as though every unanswered question from decades ago had found a way to breathe again, whispering through reopened files, reconstructed timelines, and the weary minds of those who refused to let the dead remain silent. What began as a singular pursuit of justice had become a relentless excavation of memory, and in that excavation, the line between certainty and doubt grew increasingly fragile. Across state archives and federal databases, analysts continued to feed names, dates, locations, and fragments of evidence into evolving systems, chasing correlations that might reveal the final contours of Daniel Rourke's hidden life. The data flowed endlessly, a river of possibility, yet certainty remained elusive, always just beyond reach. Each connection offered promise, each dead end delivered disappointment, and every partial alignment reopened the same agonizing question: how many stories had intersected with his without ever being recorded? In one small town in Wyoming, a retired police chief came forward with a case he had never been able to forget: a woman found dead in her home in 2002, the scene staged to resemble an accident, the investigation abandoned when no evidence surfaced. He had always believed the truth lay deeper. The security system had malfunctioned that night. The logs had been corrupted. The technicians who examined it at the time blamed outdated software. Now, with the knowledge of Rourke's expertise, the explanation felt chillingly inadequate. The case was reopened. Forensic teams descended upon evidence lockers sealed for more than 20 years, extracting brittle envelopes and cracked plastic containers, searching for anything that might have survived. Among the remnants, they found a single coil of adhesive tape, its edges torn, its surface degraded. It bore no usable DNA, but its composition matched the same industrial-grade material linked to Laura's murder. It was not proof, but it was resonance. Across the nation, similar reverberations emerged: fragments of tape, traces of tampered alarms, stories of unexplained intrusions, memories of fleeting encounters that once seemed insignificant. Each echoed the same unsettling rhythm, as if Rourke's presence had left a faint but persistent imprint wherever he passed. And yet, despite the mounting circumstantial alignment, prosecutors hesitated. The burden of proof loomed heavily. Without definitive forensic confirmation, each case hovered in legal limbo, suspended between suspicion and certainty, hope and impossibility. For families, that limbo was unbearable. They oscillated between anticipation and despair, their lives tethered to phone calls that might never come. Some had spent decades building fragile routines around absence, constructing a semblance of normalcy atop unresolved loss. Now, the reopening of old wounds threatened to destabilize everything they had built. Yet still, they waited. In support groups and community halls, stories overlapped, grief intertwining with grief, creating a shared language of endurance. They spoke of birthdays that went uncelebrated, of holidays marked by empty chairs, of milestones shadowed by absence. And in those gatherings, Laura Mitchell's name often surfaced, a symbol of persistence, a reminder that truth, however delayed, could still break through. Her story had become a beacon. For investigators, the challenge shifted from detection to endurance. Years of painstaking work yielded only fragments, each demanding exhaustive verification. They navigated bureaucratic barriers, jurisdictional disputes, funding limitations, and the ever-present erosion of evidence. Yet the memory of Laura's overlooked warning propelled them forward, a constant reminder of the stakes embedded within every overlooked detail. Late nights blurred into early mornings as analysts scrutinized maps, tracing Rourke's path across thousands of miles, reconstructing movements from gas receipts, motel logs, employment contracts, and witness recollections. Patterns emerged, faded, re-emerged. His life appeared as a series of calculated transitions, a choreography of disappearance and reinvention. He had mastered the art of becoming invisible, yet even invisibility leaves shadows. In one pivotal breakthrough, a private genealogical database, accessed through court order, revealed a distant familial match connected to remains recovered years earlier in southern Nevada. The genetic alignment was tenuous but compelling, prompting renewed excavation of archived material. Additional samples were extracted. Advanced sequencing techniques were applied. And after weeks of anticipation, the results returned with haunting clarity. The DNA was consistent. It was not definitive proof of Rourke's involvement, but it was enough to reclassify the case, enough to rewrite a death certificate, enough to deliver a measure of truth to a family that had lived for nearly 2 decades without it. The mother of the victim wept when she received the call. She had always believed her daughter had not simply vanished. Now, that belief had a fragile foundation. It did not bring peace. It brought gravity, the heavy realization that absence had transformed into irreversible loss. And yet, she said, it was better than silence. These moments, scattered and rare, fueled the relentless pursuit. Each confirmation, however partial, reinforced the conviction that persistence could still penetrate even the deepest darkness. But with each revelation came a growing awareness of scale. The potential breadth of Rourke's hidden life defied comprehension. If even a fraction of the suspected connections proved true, the magnitude of his impact would reshape perceptions of criminal invisibility, exposing vulnerabilities embedded within systems designed to protect. And at the center of it all, unmoving and impenetrable, sat Rourke himself. He watched the world through narrow windows and guarded conversations, absorbing fragments of the chaos he had set in motion. Yet he remained silent, withholding the only knowledge capable of collapsing uncertainty into truth. Psychologists described his silence as a final assertion of identity, the last domain he could control. In rare instances, when confronted with new evidence during parole board reviews, his eyes flickered with something that might have been recognition. But his lips never parted. The answers remained sealed behind a wall no one could breach. For investigators, the frustration was profound. They had dismantled the architecture of his deception. They had reconstructed his movements, exposed his methods, and revealed the warning signs that had once been ignored. And yet, the ultimate truth, the full extent of his actions, remained tantalizingly out of reach. This tension between what was known and what could never be known defined the final chapter of the pursuit. As years unfolded, funding waned, attention shifted, and new cases demanded urgency. The relentless pace of justice slowed. But the legacy of the Texas cold case endured, embedded within training manuals, investigative protocols, and collective memory. Laura Mitchell's story continued to circulate, a cautionary tale and a catalyst, reminding each new generation of detectives that even the smallest fragment, the most insignificant detail, could hold the power to resurrect truth. And in quiet moments, when the noise of investigation subsided, her name lingered, carried forward by those who refused to let silence prevail. Because in the end, the pursuit of justice is not defined solely by verdicts and convictions. It is defined by the refusal to forget. And in that refusal, the echoes of every unanswered question, every unclaimed life, every overlooked warning converge, demanding attention, demanding persistence, demanding that even in the face of uncertainty, the search must continue. The truth, fractured and incomplete, waited in the shadows, poised between revelation and oblivion, as the story approached its final, haunting reckoning. Night returned to the town like a familiar predator, slow, silent, inevitable. The streets emptied earlier now. Porch lights flicked on sooner. Curtains were drawn tighter. Conversations dropped to whispers. The confession had shaken everything loose, but instead of relief, it had unleashed a deeper fear, because a confession, no matter how detailed, was still just words. And in a case this old, words were fragile things. Investigators worked through the night, reassembling timelines, cross-checking statements, re-examining physical evidence that had once been dismissed as meaningless. Every box of files reopened. Every dusty photograph scanned again. Every grainy tape rewound. The station hummed with exhausted determination, fueled by stale coffee and the electric pressure of knowing they were standing on the edge of something monumental. One by one, fragments began to align. A gas station receipt time-stamped 1:43 a.m. near the edge of town. A surveillance tape recovered from a closed grocery store that showed headlights passing at 1:51. A traffic camera 30 miles away catching a dark sedan speeding through an empty intersection at 2:37. None of these pieces had meant anything on their own. Now, layered together, they began to outline a route, a silent journey stitched together by forgotten machines and overlooked records. The path curved directly past the abandoned service road, past the stretch of trees where the body had been found, past the point where the confession said the car had slowed, then stopped, then vanished into the night. Search teams returned to the site at first light. The land looked unchanged, but it felt different. Charged. Haunted. As if the earth itself remembered. Metal detectors swept across the soil. Dogs traced the wind. Shovels broke ground inch by inch. Every rusted bottle cap, every twisted nail, every shard of glass was logged, photographed, bagged. The sun climbed slowly, turning the dew into steam, the air thick and heavy. And then someone froze. A technician knelt near the base of a fallen tree, brushing away leaves. Beneath the damp soil, something pale surfaced. Not bone, not plastic, fabric. Carefully, gently, they uncovered it. A scrap of cloth, faded blue, frayed at the edges. The same shade as the victim's jacket. The discovery sent a ripple through the entire site. Movement slowed. Voices hushed. Every step became deliberate. They dug wider, deeper. Another fragment emerged, then another. Thread by thread, the earth surrendered what it had hidden. The jacket had been buried, not discarded. Folded, weighed down with rocks, placed there deliberately. And inside its torn lining, sealed away from rain and decay, they found something else. A thin metal chain, and attached to it a small, circular pendant, engraved with a single letter. The same letter that appeared in the confession. The room fell silent when the evidence arrived at the station. No one spoke. No one breathed. The weight of it pressed against every chest. This was no longer memory. This was no longer theory. This was physical truth. But the story still wasn't complete. The confession mentioned a second stop. A place where something had been discarded. Something that could never be retrieved. Investigators drove out again, this time following the second set of coordinates. The road narrowed into gravel. The gravel became dirt. The dirt dissolved into mud and grass. Trees thickened. The sky vanished behind tangled branches. At the end of the path lay a ravine.
Steep.
Jagged.
Deep.
A place no one went. A place where sound died. Ropes were anchored. Climbers descended. The descent took nearly an hour. The air grew colder the farther they dropped. At the bottom, water pooled in dark, stagnant patches. Insects skittered across slick stones. The dogs reacted immediately. They pulled hard toward a crevice in the rock face. Flashlights cut into the shadows. Something metallic glinted faintly. Wedged between stones, half submerged in mud, lay a knife. The blade was dulled. Rust stained its edges. But the shape was unmistakable. Forensics later confirmed it. The murder weapon. 23 years after the crime, the last physical question mark had been pulled from the earth. But closure remained elusive. Because the confession didn't end with the act. It ended with a statement that chilled even the most hardened investigators. I wasn't alone. The interrogation resumed. The suspect sat under harsh fluorescent lights, face gaunt, eyes sunken, fingers trembling. The walls seemed to close in as the questions began again, slower, sharper, more precise. Who helped you? Silence. Who knew? A breath. A swallow. Then a name. A name that detonated through the room like an explosive charge. It belonged to someone everyone knew. Someone trusted. Someone who had stood at candlelight vigils. Someone who had comforted the family. Someone who had spoken to reporters, pleading for justice. Someone who had helped search. Someone who had wiped tears from their eyes on live television. The betrayal cut deeper than the murder itself. Records were pulled. Phone logs re-examined. Old interviews replayed. Every word this second figure had ever spoken suddenly sounded different. Pauses stretched longer. Emphasis shifted. Innocent statements took on sinister weight. When detectives arrived at the address, the house was quiet. Curtains closed. No cars in the driveway. A knock. No answer. A second knock. Still nothing. They forced entry. Inside, the air was stale. Dust coated the furniture. The refrigerator was empty.
Closet stripped bara.
Drawers yanked open. They had fled. A manhunt began. Highways lit up with alerts. Border crossings flagged. Financial records monitored. Bus terminals searched. Train stations flooded with plainclothes officers. For 48 hours, the trail was cold. Then a credit card pinged. A motel 2 states away. By the time police arrived, the room was empty. The bed rumpled. The bathroom damp. A half-empty bottle of water on the nightstand. Another slip. Another breath of hope. Surveillance footage captured a lone figure in a hooded jacket leaving the building at dawn, moving quickly, never once looking back. Hours later, a state trooper spotted a car matching the description drifting across lanes on a desolate highway. Lights flashed. Sirens wailed. The vehicle did not stop. It accelerated. The chase stretched across miles of empty asphalt, engines screaming, radios crackling, adrenaline flooding every vein. The suspect's car weaved, tires screaming in protest, narrowly missing oncoming traffic. Then suddenly it swerved. The vehicle clipped the shoulder.
Spoon. Rolled.
Silence crashed down. When officers reached the wreck, they found the suspect alive but barely conscious, pinned inside twisted metal, blood pooling across shattered glass. At the hospital, under heavy guard, the second interrogation began. This time, there was no bravado.
No defiance.
Just exhaustion. And fear. The story that unfolded rewrote everything once again.
2 young men. Broke.
Angry.
Desperate.
Both carrying secrets. Both convinced the world owed them something. The plan hadn't been murder. It had been intimidation. A confrontation gone wrong. A single moment where control slipped and everything collapsed into irreversible chaos. Afterward, panic took over. They separated. They agreed to silence. They promised never to speak. And for more than 2 decades, they kept that promise. Until guilt corroded one of them from the inside. Until insomnia, paranoia, and regret eroded the silence, until the truth finally clawed its way free. The town listened as the news broke. Some cried, some raged, some felt nothing at all, numb after years of unresolved grief. But one question lingered above all others. Why now? Why after all this time? The answer was devastatingly simple. Because the past never forgets. It waits. It watches. And eventually it demands to be heard. The courtroom filled. The families took their seats. The accused were brought in, chains clinking softly with each step. Eyes met, then fell. The proceedings stretched on, dense with testimony, evidence, reconstructed timelines, and raw, unfiltered emotion. Experts spoke. Detectives testified. Forensic analysts detailed their findings. Every fragment of the story was laid bare under the sterile light of justice. And as the narrative unfolded, the community finally saw the full shape of the monster that had haunted them for 23 years. But resolution did not bring peace. It brought something heavier. The crushing understanding that this had been preventable. That one decision, one hesitation, one moment of fear, had altered countless lives forever. When the verdict finally arrived, it echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap.
Guilty.
On all counts. Sentencing would come later. But even as the gavel struck, closure remained just out of reach. Because no ruling could restore what had been taken. No sentence could undo the night that had shattered everything. Outside, the sun set behind the courthouse, painting the sky in streaks of blood orange and gray. Another day ended. Another chapter closed. Yet the weight of the past still lingered, suspended in the air, heavy and inescapable. The town exhaled, but the breath caught halfway. Because some stories never truly end. They simply fade into shadow.
And wait.
For someone to remember.